The first clock stopped during supper. No one spoke when it happened. The silver pendulum in the dining hall simply slowed, trembled once, and fell still beside the Duke of Blackthorne's untouched wine glass. The servants lowered their eyes immediately. One maid nearly dropped a plate from nervousness, because everyone in the house understood what it meant when another clock stopped. The Duke would notice, and if he noticed, he would remember, or worse, he would forget. Eleanor Vale stood near the doorway with her gloves still on, watching the silence spread across the long table like cold water. She had arrived only an hour earlier, carrying her leather case of tools and carefully folded invoices. She had expected dust, old machinery, perhaps a difficult employer. She had not expected fear. The Duke of Blackthorne slowly lifted his eyes toward the motionless clock. For one terrible moment, he seemed confused about where he was. His hand tightened around the stem of his glass. Then his expression hardened again into the stern, controlled mask people in the countryside spoke about in lowered voices. "Replace it," he said quietly. No one moved. His gaze sharpened. "Must I repeat myself?" A footman rushed toward the clock immediately. Eleanor noticed something strange then. The clock had not broken. It had been deliberately stopped. The mechanism was intact. Someone had paused it by hand. The Duke rose from the table before supper had even ended. He walked with dignity but not steadiness. His fingers brushed the back of chairs as if quietly confirming the room around him remained real. The housekeeper approached Eleanor once he disappeared. "You must forgive his grace," she whispered. "He does not enjoy unexpected interruptions." Eleanor removed her gloves slowly. "How many clocks are in this house?" The housekeeper hesitated. 72. Nearly smiled, thinking it was exaggeration. Then she saw the woman's face. It was not exaggeration. Rain pressed softly against the tall windows as Eleanor was escorted through Blackthorne Hall later that evening. The estate seemed built from silence itself. Endless corridors, tall portraits, rooms untouched by warmth, and clocks everywhere, grandfather clocks, mantel clocks, French carriage clocks, tiny gold travel clocks displayed behind glass. Some ticked loudly. Others whispered. Several had stopped completely. "The Duke collected them after his wife passed away," the housekeeper explained softly. "At first it comforted him. At first," the older woman lowered her voice further. "Now I believe he fears them." They reached the west wing, where Eleanor had been given a workroom beside the old library. As the servants carried in her cases, she walked slowly around the chamber. Half a dozen damaged clocks rested against the walls waiting for repair. Most merely needed cleaning, but one caught her attention immediately. An elegant walnut clock near the fireplace stopped at exactly 4:12. She leaned closer. The mechanism had been intentionally reset over and over again. Tiny scratches marked the brass keyhole. Someone returned this clock to the same moment repeatedly. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor turned. The Duke himself stood at the doorway. Without the dining room candlelight, he looked older, more tired. His dark coat hung neatly across broad shoulders that seemed burdened by invisible weight. Silver touched his hair at the temples. His expression remained guarded, but his eyes looked exhausted. "You are Mrs. Vale," he said. "Yes, Your Grace. I was told you restore delicate mechanisms. I do my best." His gaze moved briefly across the room before returning to her. "You are a widow," the question surprised her. "Yes, my condolences." His tone carried no emptiness. No polite performance, only quiet recognition. "Thank you," she answered softly. A strange silence settled. Then the Duke stepped further into the room and pointed toward the walnut clock. "That one is not to be repaired." Eleanor frowned slightly. "It appears functional. It is not to be repaired." His voice sharpened enough to end the discussion, but Eleanor had spent years around broken things, clocks, people, grief. She recognized desperation when she heard it. "As you wish, Your Grace." Seemed about to leave, then paused. "You have a daughter," was not a question. Eleanor stiffened slightly. "Yes." "How old?" 8. Silence. The Duke's gaze drifted somewhere distant for a moment. Then quietly, almost absently, he asked, "Does she still laugh loudly when surprised?" Eleanor blinked. "She does." Something painful moved through his expression so quickly she nearly imagined it. But then the cold restraint returned. "You may begin work tomorrow." Turned toward the door. "Grace," Eleanor said carefully. He stopped. "The clock in the dining hall tonight, it was not broken." His shoulders became still. he said after a long moment. It was not. Then he walked away into the dark corridor, leaving Eleanor alone beside 72 clocks and a question she could not stop thinking about. Why would a man intentionally stop time inside his own house? And why had he asked about her daughter as though remembering someone he had once lost? Outside, thunder rolled softly over the distant hills while somewhere deep within Blackthorne Hall, another clock suddenly stopped ticking. Eleanor began working before sunrise. The servants seemed relieved by her presence, though none said so directly. They hovered near doorways while she unpacked tools, whispered in corridors, and watched her with cautious curiosity. By noon, she understood why. The Duke's memory frightened them, not because he became cruel, because he became lost. He forgets names sometimes, one maid confessed while bringing tea. Last winter, he called the gardener by his brother's name. His brother has been dead 30 years. Servant claimed the Duke occasionally wandered into rooms and stood there without understanding why he had entered. But the strangest rumor concerned the clocks. He moves them at night, the maid whispered nervously. Changes the times. Eleanor paused while cleaning a tiny brass gear. Why? No one knows. Eleanor intended to find out. The west drawing room contained 15 clocks alone. By afternoon, she had repaired 3 minor mechanisms and restored 1 cracked pendulum arm. The work soothed her. Clocks were honest things. If damaged, they revealed where. If neglected, they slowed predictably. People were far more difficult. Rain clouds drifted beyond the tall windows while Eleanor worked quietly at a mahogany table. For several peaceful hours, she almost forgot she was inside the home of a feared aristocrat, until she sensed someone watching her. The Duke stood near the doorway again, silent as before. You repaired the Vienna regulator, he observed. Yes. It has not worked in 6 years. The spring merely needed replacing. He nodded once, though his attention remained fixed on her hands as she adjusted another mechanism. You learned from your husband, my father. Your husband allowed you to continue working. Eleanor glanced up briefly. Husband died with debts. Allowing me had little to do with it. Something unreadable crossed his face. You speak plainly. I find it simpler. Her surprise, the corner of his mouth almost moved, almost. He walked slowly through the room, stopping before several clocks as though greeting old acquaintances. Eleanor noticed he touched many of them lightly, confirming them. Like a man checking whether memories still existed. Then he paused beside the unrepaired walnut clock 4:12, still unmoving. His fingers rested near it but never touched it. You know why people collect clocks, Mrs. Vale? Most enjoy controlling time in some small way. Do you? No. That answer finally earned his full attention. Eleanor carefully set down her tools. My father repaired clocks his entire life. He used to say people misunderstand time completely. They think clocks preserve it. But they only measure loss. The Duke stared at her for the first time. Something vulnerable appeared openly in his eyes, not weakness, recognition. You loved your father, he said quietly. Yes. Your husband? The question should not have unsettled her, but somehow it did. Husband was kind, she answered carefully, not love, not really. The Duke seemed to understand the distinction anyway. A strange tension settled between them then. Quiet, personal. Dangerously intimate for 2 strangers standing beside broken clocks. Footsteps suddenly echoed outside. A young woman entered the room with effortless confidence. Lady Beatrice Ashcombe, beautiful, wealthy, perfectly aware of both. Her pale gloves matched her elegant traveling dress, and amusement danced immediately across her face when she noticed Eleanor. This is the famous clockmaker. The Duke's expression cooled instantly. Beatrice. You missed luncheon again, she said lightly. Mrs. Pembroke believes you are avoiding society entirely now. I generally am. Beatrice laughed softly before turning toward Eleanor. They say His Grace has hired you for months. You must be very talented. Eleanor bowed her head politely, but she felt the shift in atmosphere immediately. Lady Beatrice belonged to the Duke's world, young enough to still attract gossip, old enough to understand power, and clearly familiar with Blackthorne Hall. I hope the West Wing is comfortable, Beatrice continued. The Duke rarely keeps guests. I am not a guest, Eleanor replied calmly. I am employed. A brief silence followed. The Duke looked at Eleanor then, not with irritation, with interest. Beatrice noticed. Women like her always noticed. "Well," Beatrice said smoothly, "I do hope Blackthorne Hall has not already frightened you away. The servants exaggerate his grace terribly." "The servants say very little," Eleanor answered. Another silence, this one sharper. The Duke moved toward the window. "Beatrice, surely your mother requires you somewhere else." His tone remained polite, but dismissive. Beatrice's smile tightened almost invisibly. "You wish." She turned gracefully toward the door, then paused beside Eleanor. "One should be careful in this house, Mrs. Vale. Grief settles heavily here." Then she left. The room became quiet again, but not peaceful. The Duke stared out across the rain-soaked gardens for a long moment before speaking. "You need not concern yourself with Lady Beatrice." "I do not." Almost smile touched his mouth. "She dislikes being ignored." "Does your grace ignore her often?" "Yes." Was weariness beneath the answer? Eleanor resumed her work slowly. But she felt his gaze lingering again, not on her face, on the calmness around her, as though her presence softened some terrible noise inside his mind. Near evening, the Duke finally moved toward the door, then stopped suddenly. His brow furrowed. Confusion flickered openly across his features. Eleanor looked up immediately. "Your Grace!" He glanced around the room slowly, lost, just for a moment. Then his eyes found the walnut clock again. 4:12. Relief entered his face so sharply it hurt to witness. Without a word, he left the room. And Eleanor realized then that the stopped clocks were not random at all. They were anchors, tiny preserved moments scattered through the house. Moments the Duke feared losing forever. But she still did not know why one particular moment mattered enough to stop a clock again and again. Or why the time 4:12 seemed to calm him more than anything else in Blackthorne Hall. 3 days later, Eleanor met the Duke's memory for herself. It happened in the library. Afternoon sunlight filtered weakly through the tall windows while Eleanor sorted repaired gears onto velvet cloth. The Duke sat nearby reading correspondence in silence, or pretending to. She had noticed lately that he often stared at pages without turning them, as though words sometimes drifted away before reaching him. "You repaired 7 clocks already," he remarked suddenly. 9. Looked genuinely surprised. 9. You forgot the carriage clocks upstairs. His fingers tightened slightly around the letter in his hand, a tiny reaction, but she saw it. "I did," he admitted quietly, no irritation. No denial, only quiet humiliation. Eleanor continued polishing brass carefully, pretending not to notice. That seemed to help him more than sympathy would have. After several minutes he spoke again. "You have not asked questions. About your memory." His eyes lifted slowly toward her. "People usually ask eventually." "You dislike pity." "I dislike becoming a story whispered over tea." His honesty caught her off guard. Outside, distant wind stirred the trees across the estate grounds. The library smelled faintly of old paper and cedarwood. Eleanor set aside the cloth in her hands. "Mother lost pieces of herself before she died," she said softly. "Neighbors treated her as though she vanished before she was gone. I remember how lonely that made her." Duke watched her carefully. "And you do not think me lonely. I think you are terrified." The words escaped before caution could stop them. Silence followed, heavy, personal. She expected offense. Instead, the Duke looked down at the letter in his hands and said quietly, "Yes." Was the first completely unguarded thing she had heard from him, and somehow far more intimate than flirtation. A knock interrupted them. The butler entered stiffly. "Grace, Lady Beatrice and Mrs. Pembroke have arrived for tea." Duke closed his eyes briefly. "Of course they have." Within 20 minutes the peaceful library transformed into a battlefield disguised as polite society. Mrs. Pembroke spoke loudly enough for every servant to hear. Lady Beatrice remained graceful but observant, watching everything, especially Eleanor. "So unusual," Mrs. Pembroke said while stirring tea. "A woman working among estate staff rather than remarrying." Eleanor smiled politely. "Practicality leaves little time for social approval." Mrs. Pembroke blinked. The Duke hid amusement behind his teacup. "Beatrice noticed that too." "And your daughter?" Beatrice asked smoothly. "Does she remain in the village?" "She stays with my sister while I work." "You must miss her terribly." "I do." Duke's gaze shifted toward Eleanor immediately at the softness in her voice. Mrs. Pembroke sighed dramatically. "Children require stability. It is unfortunate when circumstances force women into difficult positions." Before Eleanor could answer, the Duke spoke quietly. "Mrs. Vale's circumstances appear to have produced competence rather than tragedy." The entire room stilled. Mrs. Pembroke flushed faintly. Beatrice lowered her teacup slowly. Eleanor herself looked toward the Duke in surprise, because his defense had not sounded performative. It sounded personal. The conversation recovered awkwardly afterward, but tension lingered beneath every polite word. When tea finally ended, Eleanor escaped gratefully into the gardens before sunset. The estate grounds stretched wide beneath fatting golden light. Roses climbed old stone walls. Wet earth smelled rich after recent rain. For the first time in days she breathed easily until footsteps approached behind her. "You handled Mrs. Pembroke admirably." Duke, Eleanor turned slowly. She was not particularly difficult. She is for most people. Walked beside her along the gravel path. Without servants or walls around him, he seemed less imposing somehow, still reserved, still dignified, but more human. "You should not have defended me publicly," Eleanor said. "Why, it creates gossip. That began the moment you arrived." She could not argue with that. They continued walking quietly. Then the Duke stopped beside an old sundial overtaken slightly by ivy. "Wife hated this garden," he said suddenly. Eleanor glanced toward him. She preferred London. "You loved her." A long pause followed. He answered eventually, though not correctly. Honesty in his voice unsettled her again. "What does that mean?" "I admired her beauty, her charm, her ability to move through society effortlessly." His gaze remained fixed on the fatting roses. "But admiration is not always understanding." Something in those words felt painfully earned. Eleanor studied him quietly. "You understand people more now. Too late for usefulness." Sadness beneath the statement lingered heavily between them. Then voices echoed distantly from the terrace. Lady Beatrice, laughing, looking for him. The Duke's expression changed immediately, weariness returning like armor. "She wishes to marry you," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. His gaze shifted toward her. "Does that concern you?" The question landed too softly, too directly. Eleanor looked away first. "It is none of my concern." The Duke did not answer immediately, and somehow his silence felt more dangerous than words. Before either could speak again, Beatrice appeared near the terrace steps. "There you are." Her smile remained lovely. But Eleanor sensed tension beneath it now, especially when Beatrice noticed how close they stood. "The guests are departing," she informed the Duke. "Mrs. Pembroke insists upon saying farewell." "I shall come presently." Beatrice nodded, yet she did not leave immediately. Her eyes moved once between Eleanor and the Duke, measuring, understanding. Then she finally walked away. The Duke exhaled slowly afterward. "You should return inside before darkness," he said quietly. Eleanor nodded. But as she turned toward the house, she heard him speak again. "Mrs. Vale." She looked back for a moment. His guarded composure seemed dangerously close to breaking. "When I forget things," he said carefully, "I sometimes remember feelings first." Said nothing. "I do not always recall conversations," he continued quietly, "or names or dates, but I remember how certain people make a room feel." The evening wind moved softly through the roses around them. And suddenly Eleanor understood why he kept stopping clocks, because feelings survived longer than memory, and he was desperately trying to preserve both. The letter arrived on a cold Thursday morning. Eleanor recognized her sister's handwriting immediately. She opened it beside the workshop window while rain tapped softly against the glass. "Clara has been asking about you every evening. She says the house feels quieter without your humming. Also, she insists I tell you she finally repaired the small kitchen clock herself." Eleanor smiled despite herself. Then the letter continued. "A gentleman visited the village yesterday asking questions about Blackthorne Hall. People are beginning to talk. You know how they are." Her smile faded slowly. "Of course people were talking. A widowed clockmaker spending weeks inside the estate of an unmarried duke was enough to feed gossip for months." She folded the letter carefully just as the Duke entered the room. He noticed her expression immediately. "Bad news?" "No, merely village curiosity." His jaw tightened faintly. "They speak carelessly. They always have." Still, unease settled between them because both understood what gossip could become, especially for a woman. The Duke approached one of the repaired mantel clocks near the fireplace. Eleanor watched him reset the hands with unusual precision. "You missed breakfast," she observed. "I was occupied." With remembering, the question slipped out gently. He paused, then nodded once. Eleanor crossed the room slowly. "You need not hide it from me." Something vulnerable flickered across his face again. You say that now. What changes later, when you finally witness how humiliating it truly is? Before she could answer, his hand suddenly stilled on the clock. Confusion entered his expression, sharp. Sudden, he frowned toward the mechanism as though he no longer understood what it was. Eleanor moved carefully closer. Grace, his breathing changed slightly. I know this clock, he murmured. I know I do. You restored it years ago, perhaps. No, his brow tightened painfully. Someone gave it to me. Genuinely distressed now, searching desperately through thoughts refusing to organize themselves, Eleanor gently touched the clock. There's an inscription. Look down for Edwin so you may never lose another hour. The Duke went completely still, then slowly closed his eyes. Brother, he whispered. The grief in those two words felt ancient. Eleanor stepped back instinctively, suddenly understanding she had witnessed something deeply private. When he opened his eyes again, shame had already replaced vulnerability. I dislike these episodes. You remembered, failing first. That is not failure. His expression hardened immediately. You are kind to me because you pity me. No, answer came too quickly, too honestly. They stared at one another across the quiet room. Then footsteps approached rapidly outside. Lady Beatrice entered without waiting to be announced, and stopped immediately upon sensing tension. I hope I am not interrupting. The Duke moved away from Eleanor at once. Not at all. The distance appeared forced now. Beatrice noticed. Of course she noticed. I came because my mother insists upon hosting another dinner next week, she said lightly. Half the county will attend. The Duke looked exhausted already. I have little interest in dinners. That is precisely why you should attend one. Tone softened slightly. People are worried about you, Edwin. Eleanor had never heard anyone use his given name before. The intimacy of it shifted something unexpectedly inside her chest. The Duke's expression cooled. I did not realize I required public inspection. Beatrice sighed quietly. You require support. For the first time since Eleanor arrived at Blackthorne Hall, genuine frustration entered the Duke's voice. What I require is peace. Followed, Beatrice absorbed the sharpness with visible hurt. Then her gaze drifted toward Eleanor again, and understanding settled across her features with painful clarity. Oh, she said softly. The room suddenly felt too small. You misunderstand, the Duke said immediately, but Beatrice gave a faint smile already filled with quiet defeat. Do I? She turned gracefully toward Eleanor. I owe you an apology, Mrs. Vale. I believed you temporary. Eleanor stiffened. Lady Beatrice, no, it is quite all right. Beatrice's composure remained elegant, though sadness touched her eyes now. One always knows when someone begins looking at another person differently. The Duke stepped forward. Beatrice. She shook her head gently. You need not explain yourself to me. Then she left. The silence afterward felt devastating. Eleanor turned away first. This is precisely why gossip becomes dangerous. Duke looked toward the doorway long after Beatrice disappeared, then quietly said, I never encouraged her, but you cared for her. Not love, again. Eleanor heard the distinction, and somehow it frightened her more now, because she was beginning to recognize the way his voice changed around her, beginning to recognize her own changes too. That evening, Eleanor sat alone in her room reading Clara's letter again while candlelight flickered softly nearby. Outside, wind moved through the dark gardens. She should leave. Any sensible woman would. The Duke was vulnerable, lonely. Ill, and yet when he looked at her, she never felt mistaken for someone else. She felt seen more clearly than she had in years. A sudden knock interrupted her thoughts. The Duke stood outside her door without his coat, without formal composure, only exhaustion. I remembered something tonight, he said quietly. Eleanor waited. The first thing I forgot completely. Her chest tightened unexpectedly. What was it? He looked at her with unbearable honesty. Wife's voice. The pain inside those words entered the room like winter itself, and before Eleanor realized what she was doing, she reached for his hand. He stared down at her fingers wrapped around his. Neither moved, neither spoke, because some moments become dangerous precisely from their gentleness. After that night, distance became impossible, not openly, not scandalously, but quietly, constantly. The Duke began seeking her presence without meaning to. Eleanor noticed it first during breakfast when he delayed leaving until she entered the room, then during afternoons when he wandered toward whichever chamber she worked in. Sometimes he spoke, Sometimes he simply sat nearby while clocks ticked softly around them, and somehow that became more intimate than conversation. One evening, Eleanor found him standing alone in the music room after sunset. The piano remained untouched beneath candlelight. "You play?" she asked softly. The Duke looked toward the instrument. "Wife did." Was no bitterness in his voice anymore, only distance. "You never learned," he gave a faint shake of his head. "I was raised to manage estates, not emotions." Eleanor almost smiled. "That sounds lonely." It was efficient. She walked closer to the piano. "Daughter plays badly," she admitted, with enormous confidence. For the first time in days, genuine warmth touched his expression. "I would like to hear that." Answer settled unexpectedly deep inside her chest, as though he had spoken not about music but belonging. Then suddenly his face changed. His gaze drifted toward the candlelight with confusion. Eleanor recognized it immediately now, the slipping. "Your Grace," he frowned slightly. "What day is it?" "Tuesday." "No." His breathing became uneven. "No, it was winter this morning." Eleanor moved closer carefully. "You worked too long today." He pressed fingers against his temple. "I lose hours sometimes now." Fear entered his voice quietly, not dramatic, not loud, which made it worse. Eleanor guided him gently toward a nearby chair. "Look at me." He did. "Tell me 5 things you can see." Stared at her in surprise. "What?" "5 things." Slowly, reluctantly, he answered. "The piano, the candles, blue curtains, the fireplace." Then he stopped because he was looking at her. Eleanor waited softly. "And you?" he finished quietly. The confusion began easing from his face little by little. "You're here," he murmured almost to himself. "Yes." Something shifted then, not romance exactly, dependency, trust, and both frightened her deeply. Days later, Blackthorne Hall hosted the long-avoided dinner. The county arrived dressed in silk, pearls, and judgment. Eleanor had intended to remain upstairs entirely, until the Duke himself appeared outside her room. "You are attending." That would be inappropriate. That ceased mattering weeks ago. His bluntness startled a laugh from her despite herself, but his expression remained serious. "I dislike these gatherings," he admitted quietly. "You make them bearable." Honesty left her defenseless, so she attended, and immediately regretted it. Whispers followed her across the ballroom before introductions even ended. Women glanced toward her gown, elegant but modest compared to theirs. Men watched with open curiosity. Most unsettling of all was how openly the Duke stayed near her, not touching, never improper, yet constantly aware of her presence. Mrs. Pembroke nearly choked on surprise when the Duke interrupted another guest mid-conversation simply because Eleanor had been standing alone too long. Lady Beatrice observed everything from across the room, and unlike the others, she looked sad rather than cruel. During supper, a gentleman beside Eleanor smiled knowingly. "They say His Grace trusts you with his clocks." "I repair them." "Yes," he said lightly, "but I suspect that is not all." The implication landed clearly. Before Eleanor could respond, the Duke's voice cut sharply across the table. "Malcolm." The entire conversation stopped. The Duke's expression remained calm, dangerously calm. "You will speak respectfully to Mrs. Vale." Silence swallowed the room. Sir Malcolm flushed immediately. "I intended no insult." "Then improve your intentions." No one spoke afterward. Eleanor herself could barely breathe. Because the Duke had just defended her publicly again, not politely, possessively. Later that evening, while musicians played quietly in the ballroom, Eleanor escaped onto the terrace for air. Cold night wind touched her face. Moments later, footsteps followed. "You should not have done that," she said without turning. "He insulted you. He implied scandal, which society already believes." The Duke stepped beside her beneath the moonlight. "Do you care?" "Yes." Looked genuinely surprised. "Why?" "Because women survive differently than men do." Answer seemed to strike him harder than anger would have. For a long moment neither spoke. Music drifted faintly from inside the ballroom. Then the Duke said quietly, "I forgot your daughter's name yesterday." Eleanor turned toward him immediately. His expression carried quiet devastation. "You never told me," he continued softly. "But I had asked before. And yesterday I realized I could not remember the answer." Emotion tightened painfully inside her chest. "Her name is Clara," repeated it carefully. "Clara. Though committing it somewhere deeper than memory. I wrote it down afterward," he admitted. "In case I lose it again." Could barely speak. Because suddenly she understood something terrible. The Duke was not merely preserving moments. He was preparing for disappearance. And he was doing it alone. Inside the ballroom, laughter echoed brightly from people untouched by such fears. But outside, beneath the cold stars, the Duke looked at Eleanor with helpless honesty. "I am becoming dependent on your presence," he confessed quietly. Her heart stumbled painfully. "That is dangerous." Yes. Neither moved away, and for one impossible moment it felt as though the entire world had gone still around them, like one of his stopped clocks. The first snow arrived early that year. White covered the gardens by dawn, softening Blackthorne Hall into something almost peaceful. Eleanor should have left before winter, she knew that. Instead, she remained. Because each time she prepared to go, the Duke forgot something else. A servant's name, a meeting, whether he had eaten. And each loss quietly broke something inside him. One afternoon, Eleanor found him standing in the west corridor staring at a portrait, not confused, heartbroken. "That is my mother," he said softly before she could ask. The painting showed a severe-looking woman with intelligent eyes. "You resemble her," Eleanor observed. She remembered everything. His voice carried such quiet grief that Eleanor moved beside him instinctively. "She used to recite entire books from memory when I was a child," he continued. "Now I cannot always recall breakfast. You are still yourself." For how long? The question lingered painfully between them. Before Eleanor could answer, voices echoed nearby, servants whispering. They fell silent immediately upon noticing the Duke. But not quickly enough, he had heard. So had Eleanor, poor man. "He grows worse each month, and the clockmaker remains constantly beside him now." The Duke's posture stiffened almost invisibly. Then he walked away without another word. That evening he did not appear for supper. Eleanor found him hours later in the locked clock gallery upstairs. The room startled her. Dozens upon dozens of stopped clocks surrounded him in silence, none ticking, none moving, preserved, frozen. The Duke sat alone near the window with papers scattered beside him, lists, dates, notes written carefully in precise handwriting. When he noticed Eleanor, shame crossed his face immediately. "You should not be here." She ignored the remark and picked up one of the papers. "If I forget the East Garden, the roses bloom latest near the stone wall. If I forget Clara, she laughs before speaking when excited. If I forget Eleanor," her breath caught. The sentence stopped unfinished. The Duke stood abruptly. "Not read those." Eleanor looked at him with tears already burning unexpectedly behind her eyes. "You're writing instructions to yourself." "I am trying to survive." Honesty shattered something between them completely. Eleanor stepped closer slowly. "You are not alone." "Yes, I am." His voice finally cracked with frustration. "Because eventually I will forget even the people kind enough to stay." Filled the gallery, snow drifted quietly beyond the windows. The Duke looked exhausted suddenly, older than before. "I cannot bear the thought of looking at you one day without recognition," he admitted softly. Emotion rose sharply inside her chest, because she realized then he was not merely afraid of forgetting. He was afraid of hurting her. "I should leave," she whispered. Pain crossed his face instantly. Neither moved. The clocks around them remained perfectly still. Then Eleanor noticed one smaller clock near the fireplace. 4:12 again, always 4:12. She turned toward it slowly. What happened at this hour? The Duke froze. For a moment she thought he might refuse entirely. Then he sat down heavily beside the window. "Years ago," he said quietly, "your daughter visited this estate." Eleanor stared at him in shock. "What? You do not remember me because the meeting was brief. Your husband had come seeking work from my steward. You waited outside with Clara in the rain." Stirred faintly in Eleanor's memory, a large estate, a frightened child. The Duke's gaze lowered toward the stopped clock. "She became separated from you in the gardens." Eleanor's breath caught. She remembered that, the panic, the terrible fear. "I found her crying near the greenhouse," he continued softly. "She asked me whether clocks could stop bad moments from happening." Emotion tightened painfully inside Eleanor's throat. She was only 5. "Yes." His voice gentled unexpectedly. "She wore a yellow ribbon in her hair." Eleanor could barely breathe now. The Duke looked toward the frozen clock again. Was the moment she stopped crying, consumed the room. He gave her one of the small garden clocks. Eleanor whispered faintly, memory returning fully now. "I never knew it was you." Duke nodded. She laughed when I told her it was broken. Something warm and devastating moved through Eleanor all at once. Years ago, before either truly knew the other, her daughter had left a mark strong enough to survive his collapsing memory. And suddenly the notes made sense. The stopped clocks, the desperation. He had been preserving moments of feeling, moments connected to people who made him feel less alone. Eleanor stepped toward him slowly. You remembered her. For years. Me? The question escaped before caution could stop it. The Duke looked up at her then with unbearable vulnerability. You looked terrified when you found Clara again, he whispered. But when you held her, his voice softened further. I remember thinking no one had ever looked at me with that kind of love. Tears blurred Eleanor's vision unexpectedly, because no one had ever spoken to her like that before, not her husband, not anyone. The Duke stood slowly. I think, he said quietly, I began missing you long before we truly met. For the first time since arriving at Blackthorne Hall, Eleanor no longer knew how to leave. The scandal reached the village before Christmas. By then, it no longer mattered whether anything improper had occurred. People preferred imagination to truth. Shopkeepers lowered their voices when Eleanor's sister entered stores. Women at church spoke sympathetically about compromised widows. Even servants at Blackthorne Hall became careful around her. The Duke noticed all of it, and grew colder because of it, not toward Eleanor, toward everyone else. One snowy afternoon, Lady Beatrice arrived unexpectedly. Eleanor found her alone in the drawing room beside the fire. For once, Beatrice looked tired rather than elegant. I came to warn you, she said quietly. About what? My mother intends to pressure the Duke publicly after Christmas. She believes marriage will calm the gossip. Eleanor's stomach tightened. To you? Beatrice gave a faint, sad smile. She still hopes so. Settled between them, then Beatrice looked directly at Eleanor. He loves you. The words landed softly, dangerously softly. Eleanor looked away immediately. You mistake attachment for love. No. Beatrice's voice carried painful certainty. I have watched men admire women my entire life. This is different. Emotion tightened sharply inside Eleanor's chest because part of her already knew. May not say it, Beatrice continued quietly. But he fears losing you more than he fears losing himself. The room fell silent except for the fire crackling gently nearby. Then Beatrice added something unexpected. And I think you fear the same. Later that evening, Eleanor packed half her belongings, not because she wished to leave, because staying had become unbearable. The Duke deserved peace, not more whispers, not more pity disguised as curiosity. She folded Clara's small knitted scarf carefully into her traveling case just as a knock sounded. The Duke entered before she answered. His eyes moved immediately toward the packed belongings, and something inside his expression changed, not anger, fear. You are leaving. Eleanor forced herself to remain calm. Yes. When? Tomorrow. Silence heavy enough to crush breath itself. The Duke stepped further into the room slowly. Because of the gossip, because this cannot continue. Cannot? The question sounded painfully genuine. Eleanor looked at him then, really looked at him, at the exhaustion beneath his restraint, the vulnerability hidden beneath pride. You rely on me too much. Yes. No hesitation, no denial. The honesty nearly broke her resolve instantly. And she stopped. The Duke waited. But Eleanor could not finish the sentence, because admitting her feelings aloud would make leaving impossible. He seemed to understand anyway. You believe leaving will protect us both? Yes. A long silence followed. Then the Duke quietly asked, will it? Eleanor had no answer. Snow tapped softly against the windows while candlelight flickered between them. Finally, the Duke spoke again. I forgot my father's face yesterday. Pain entered the room so suddenly it felt physical. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. I remembered his hands, he continued softly, but not his face. She crossed the room before thinking, took his hand, held it tightly. The Duke looked down at their joined fingers with heartbreaking stillness. I am so tired of losing things, he whispered. Emotion overwhelmed her then, not dramatic, not loud, just deep enough to finally destroy restraint. You are not something to survive, Edwin. His breath caught softly at the sound of his name, the first time she had ever spoken it. I know you are afraid, she continued quietly. But you are still kind, still intelligent, still you. Stared at her as though the words themselves hurt. Eleanor, I do not care what society says. The confession trembled between them, raw, terrifying. The Duke lifted his free hand slowly toward her face, stopping just short of touching her, as though afraid she might disappear. I love you, he said softly. No grand declaration, no performance, only truth, and somehow that made it devastating. Tears filled Eleanor's eyes instantly. because she believed him completely. The Duke finally touched her cheek then with trembling gentleness. "I think I have loved you since the moment you treated me like a man instead of a tragedy." Emotion broke through her carefully guarded heart entirely. She leaned into his hand before she could stop herself, and the Duke closed his eyes briefly as though the small gesture meant everything. But happiness lasted only moments, because suddenly confusion crossed his face again, sharp. Disorienting, his gaze shifted uncertainly around the room. Eleanor's heart dropped. "Edwin?" He frowned slightly, then looked back at her. Fear entered her chest, until slowly, softly, he whispered her name. Relief nearly weakened her knees. The Duke exhaled shakily afterward. "I remembered. Yes, I remembered you." Somehow that moment, frightened, fragile, imperfect, felt more intimate than any kiss could have been. Christmas morning arrived beneath pale silver skies. Blackthorne Hall had not celebrated properly in years. The servants admitted this quietly among themselves while decorating garlands across staircases. But this year felt different, warmer somehow, not because the Duke had recovered. He had not. There were still difficult mornings, forgotten conversations, sudden confusion. But now he no longer faced them alone. Eleanor remained at Blackthorne Hall after all. The gossip continued briefly, then gradually lost strength when scandal failed to appear. Because what existed between the Duke and Eleanor was too sincere to become entertaining. 3 days after Christmas, Clara finally arrived at the estate. The Duke waited near the entrance hall with visible nervousness while snow drifted softly outside. "You look terrified," Eleanor murmured gently. "I am." Before she could answer, the front doors opened, and Clara rushed inside immediately. "Mama." Eleanor knelt to catch her daughter in her arms, laughing softly through sudden tears. Then Clara noticed the Duke. She stared for one long, thoughtful moment. "You're the clock man." Duke blinked in surprise, then something warm broke openly across his face. He answered quietly. "I suppose I am," smiled brightly. "You gave me the broken clock." "I did. You looked less grumpy then." Eleanor covered a laugh quickly while the Duke actually smiled, truly smiled, not restrained, not careful. The sight stunned half the servants nearby. Clara walked directly toward him without hesitation. Children always sense truth faster than adults. "You still forget things sometimes?" she asked openly. The Duke glanced briefly toward Eleanor before answering, considered this seriously, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper. "I made you something." Duke unfolded it carefully. A childish drawing, the estate, the gardens, and 3 figures standing together beneath enormous yellow stars. "You remember us," Clara explained proudly. The Duke stared at the drawing for a long moment. When he finally looked up again, his eyes were wet. Something inside Eleanor's chest ached beautifully at the sight. That evening, snow covered the estate grounds in quiet white stillness while Eleanor found the Duke alone in the clock gallery again. Only this time, several clocks had been restarted. Soft ticking filled the room. "You repaired them?" she asked softly. The Duke nodded. "I think." He paused thoughtfully. "I spent too long trying to preserve moments instead of living inside them." Eleanor moved beside him slowly. "And now," he looked at her, now older somehow, gentler, "I know I will still lose pieces of myself." His voice remained calm, honest. But perhaps memory is not the only way people remain. Emotion tightened softly inside her chest. The Duke reached into his coat pocket and removed a small brass key. "For the walnut clock," he said quietly. 4:12. Eleanor stared at it. "You want me to repair it?" "Yes." Duke's gaze held her steadily. "Because I no longer wish to live in only one moment." Filled her eyes unexpectedly, not from sadness, from healing. Together they crossed the gallery toward the old walnut clock. Eleanor opened the mechanism carefully while the Duke stood beside her in silence. Dust shimmered softly beneath candlelight. Outside, snow fell endlessly across the dark countryside. Finally, Eleanor adjusted the final gear. The pendulum trembled once, then moved. Tick, tick, tick. The sound filled the room gently, alive again. The Duke watched the moving hands with quiet emotion. Then he turned toward Eleanor slowly. "I may forget many things still. I know. But I think some feelings survive even memory." Eleanor smiled through tears. "Yes." He touched her hand carefully, not possessively, not fearfully, simply certain. And for the first time in years, the clocks inside Blackthorne Hall no longer sounded like grief. They sounded like life continuing. Months later, Villagers would still tell stories about the stern Duke of Blackthorne and the quiet clockmaker who changed his house. But the truth remained smaller and far more human than gossip ever understood. An aging man frightened of disappearing, a woman tired of living without being truly seen, and two lonely people who discovered that love was not the preservation of perfect moments. It was staying, even while time continued moving forward. One spring afternoon, Eleanor found the Duke asleep beside the library window while Clara quietly drew pictures nearby. Sunlight touched his silver hair softly. A book rested forgotten in his lap. For one frightened instant, Eleanor wondered whether he had forgotten where he was again. Then his eyes opened slowly, and immediately found her. There was brief confusion, the usual searching. But then warmth returned, recognition, relief. "Eleanor," he said softly, as though her name itself guided him home. And across the quiet room filled with ticking clocks and gentle afternoon light, she realized something beautiful. Even when memory failed him, love kept teaching him the way back.